Welcome to Lesson 7, Designing a Project Plan. In this lesson, you're going to rein in your creative explorations and design a project plan that will define the intention, process, and schedule for your project. The goal of this lesson is that you design a plan that is detailed and specific enough to begin work on the final version of your project and bring it all the way to completion. Now, hopefully in the previous lessons, you were able to create prototypes for your project, present it to others to get feedback, and then incorporate what you've learned. You may have even gone through another round of prototyping and feedback. The cycle of prototyping, feedback, and further iteration can go on for as long as you need it to, or as long as your schedule permits. But at some point, you need to begin work on the final version of your project. This lesson is going to help you create a project plan that will help you do just that. Now, one of the most important differences between the project plan we're going to be making in this lesson and a more traditional project proposal is that the goal of this project plan is not to get permission from somebody else or to seek funding. The goal of this project plan is to help you direct your habits and actions to ensure the successful completion of your project. Now, the specifics of a project plan can change dramatically depending on the type of project. Every project has its own unique needs and elements that need to be addressed. But in this lesson, I'm going to provide you with a project plan template that you can adapt to meet the specific needs and elements for your project. Now, it's important to note here that this course is not intended to teach you how to market or monetize your project. That is a completely different topic that's outside the scope of this course. The goal of this course is the creative process. The process that's going to allow you to conceive of a project and to work with it all the way through to completion, and hopefully with a high level of quality. So the goal of this project plan is to help you create and complete high-quality creative work. So although every project plan will look a little different, there are some common elements that nearly every project plan will contain. So let's start there, focusing on the essential elements of a project plan. The first essential element is the project description. So this should be an updated version of the project description that you started earlier in this course. But now you're going to update it with everything you've learned from prototyping and feedback. Remember, a project description describes what your project is. It's a functional description of your project. Next, you want to write a description of your desired audience. Who is this work for? It is a fool's errand to try and please everybody. So you want to ask yourself, what are the attributes of the people that you want your project to connect with? What are their interests? Where might they find your work? Now, we've touched upon the idea of a desired audience earlier in this course, but now it's time to get specific. You want to describe your desired audience with as much detail as possible. This is important because you know you can't please everybody. So while you're creating the work, you want to keep in mind the type of person that you want to connect with. And you want to know whether you're trying to appeal to a niche audience or whether you want your work to have mass appeal. Either are fine, but you need to go into the creation of your project with your eyes open. You want to know what kind of people you're trying to connect with. Now, I'd like to remind you here, as you're creating your project, you should seek out feedback from representative members of your desired audience. That's one of the best ways to make sure that your work is connecting with the type of people you want to connect with. Next, what is your project intent? What is your intention with your project? If the project description focuses on what your project is, then the project intent should describe what you want your project to do. What is the purpose of your project? What impact are you hoping it will have? What do you want people to think about when they experience your work? What do you want them to feel? What reactions are you looking for from your audience? Now, the project intent is also a great place to define what success for your project looks like. Does success mean sales? Does it mean reviews? Does it mean a certain number of likes or followers? How do you define success for your project? Next, you need to lay out the tasks that are necessary for you to complete your project. Now, to me, this section is the most important. It will detail the specific tasks that you need to complete in order to finish your project. You also need to order this list of tasks, so you always know what you need to do next and what you've already accomplished. So a well-crafted and ordered list of tasks will ensure that you always know how to move forward with your project. Now, if necessary, this list can include prototyping and feedback. Now, this list of tasks will probably be the longest section in your project plan. This list is also one of the most variable elements of a project plan. A list of tasks for somebody writing a children's book will look completely different from the list of tasks of somebody designing a video game. Anything and everything can go in your list of tasks. There's no task too small that it can't be included in this list. Now, of course, it's up to you to figure out how granular you want to get with this list. Some people work best with a broad outline of tasks, and underneath each task, there's a list of subtasks. So it's up to you to figure out what list of tasks is right for your project. And remember, you can always refine your project plan as you move through it. But remember, the goal of this list of tasks is to describe the steps that are necessary for you to bring your project to completion. Which brings us to the next essential element for our project plan, a completion date. Now, although it's okay for a project to move forward without a completion date, I find that it's best to hold yourself to a schedule that will help you focus your time and efforts and keep you coming back to the studio. I find that a completion date creates a positive pressure within me. Even if the deadline for a project is self-imposed, it's still something to shoot for. And without a desired completion date, you may feel like you have an infinite amount of time to complete your project. In my experience, this tends to result in a lack of urgency. I know for me, without a completion date, I tend to procrastinate and put off getting into the studio. Because why not? If I don't have a completion date, there's no sense of urgency for me to manage my time. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to explore some strategies that will push you to show up in the studio again and again to make sure your project is finished. Now, one strategy we're going to talk about is the idea of announcing your completion date publicly. You're more likely to hold yourself to a completion date if other people are expecting you to. But in order to publicly announce a completion date, you need to figure out what that completion date is. This completion date should be based on your best estimate for how long your project will take. You want to be able to find a balance between giving yourself enough time to make high-quality work, but to not push your completion date so far out that you procrastinate. Your completion date should give you a sense of positive pressure. So once you have a list of tasks and you have a completion date, then you can create a timeline. Your timeline will help you figure out how much time you have to complete each task on your list. And of course, your timeline needs to account for all of the tasks on your list. Now, one quick note here regarding your tasks, your timeline, and your completion date. If you get to choose the completion date based on your schedule alone, then once you've figured out your tasks, you can then select your completion date by how long you think each task is going to take. You can create the timeline for your tasks and base your completion date off of that. Now, some people have a very limited amount of time to work on their creative projects. So if you only have a month or two to bring a project to completion, you may need to base the whole project plan around that firm deadline. A deadline may define the scope of your project as well as the tasks necessary to complete it. So these three elements, tasks, timeline, and completion date, should be developed in relationship with one another. So these are the essential components of a project plan. I think that nearly every project plan should contain these essential elements. But as we talked about before, the specifics of a project plan can vary wildly depending on the project. So let me take you through a few additional elements that you may need to incorporate into your project plan. Many of these will not be relevant for most projects, but I at least want to cover them so you can start thinking about whether or not you need to incorporate them into your project plan. Now, some projects require money, which means you may need to think about your budget. Creating a budget will help you best use the financial resources you have. It will also help you figure out if you need to seek additional funding for your project. Now, the process of seeking funding, whether it's through crowdfunding or grant writing, is a bit out of the scope of this course. But in the event that you do need to seek additional funds, that should absolutely be included in your project plan. So if you have a limited amount of funds with which to create your project, you should plan for that. You want to wisely use the financial resources that you have. You don't want to run out of money. So one final note here. If you are seeking funding for your project, then your project plan can be used to persuade others to provide that funding. Many grants require you to submit a project proposal so they can evaluate whether or not the project is right for them to invest in. This project plan can be adapted for that purpose. Next, you may want to include a section about materials. If your project is heavily dependent on materials, you need to plan for that. For example, if you're creating furniture or clothing, you may want to consider putting that into your project plan, particularly if the materials that you need are rare, specialized, or time-consuming to get. Even more simple projects require you to have the right materials. I regularly need to check my stock of paper and pencils. So if you think it's necessary, you may want to include a section about materials in your project plan. The materials section should focus on what you need and how and when you're going to get them. Next, skill acquisition. I find that the type of projects I do often require me to learn new skills. Learning new skills can be time-consuming. So during the creation of your project, you may discover that you need to learn new skills to create your vision for your project. This is incredibly common. It could be lighting, it could be video editing, it could be photography, it could be public speaking, it could be some form of construction, it could be a new tool, it could be learning how to use a new type of paint or canvas. The list is nearly endless. So if your project requires you to learn a new skill, you need to plan for that. You need to plan how you're going to learn that skill and, of course, how long it's going to take you. So in your project plan, skill acquisition can be its own section, or it can be a subsection of your task list and timeline. But it's just one more thing to consider as you're creating your project plan. Next, collaborators. Now in this course, I'm assuming you're working on your project by yourself, but many projects require collaborators. And some people just enjoy collaborating creatively with others. If you're working with collaborators, you're not just creating a project plan for yourself, you're creating a project plan so multiple people know what they're doing at every step of the way. Now, I highly recommend gaining experience completing creative projects on your own before you bring in collaborators. Collaborators can be great. They can be so helpful, particularly if they have skills that you don't. But they can also bring additional challenges. Collaborators will bring with them their own sets of needs and desires, their own vision for a project. And managing collaborators and working within teams is a skill in and of itself. Now, if you're working with collaborators, you also need to figure out who's doing what. How are you going to divide the responsibilities of the project? This should be reflected in your project plan. The goal of a good project plan is so that everybody working on the project knows how to move forward. They know what to do at every step of the way to complete the project. This is true if you're working on your project by yourself or if you're working with a team. And finally, you may want to think about your project launch. Now, obviously, before you worry about putting your work out into the world, you need to have completed some work. And that's the focus of this course, bringing creative projects to completion. But once you gain experience completing creative projects, you need to think about what you want to do with them, how you're going to get them out into the world, how you want to launch your work into the public sphere. So designing a project launch means deciding what happens with your work once it's completed. This could include gallery openings, publication, articles, podcasts, marketing, social media, monetization, all kinds of things. So again, my goal in this course is to help you complete your vision for your project. But for most projects, not all, but for most of them, people want to get their work in front of the eyes of other people. And designing a project launch will help you do that. Now, of course, this is an incomplete list of potential project plan elements. Depending on the project, there's a wide range of other elements your project plan might need. But hopefully, I've started you thinking about what your project plan needs to include, and how you can use a project plan to figure out what needs to happen for you to complete your project. So with all of this in mind, let's get you to your task for this lesson. So your task for today is to create a project plan. Your project plan should include a project description, writing about your desired audience. It should define your project intent. It should contain an ordered list of tasks that are necessary for you to complete your project. It should include a completion date, and it needs a timeline. Your timeline should include how long you think each task will take. And remember, these final three elements, tasks, timeline, and completion date, should be developed in relationship to one another. And in your project plan, they can appear in any order that works best for your project. If necessary, your project plan can include additional elements, including costs or budget, materials, skill acquisition, collaborators, or a description of your project launch. And of course, your project may require additional elements that I haven't addressed. So you need to ask yourself what your project plan needs, even if I haven't brought it up in this lesson. So what I've tried to do is give you a basic outline for a successful project plan. And while creating your project plan, you always need to keep in mind the purpose of this project plan is for you to define the intention, process, and schedule for your project. A good project plan will allow you to consistently move forward toward the successful completion of your project. So I hope you can join me for today's video journal where I'm going to be taking you through my project plan, so you can see these ideas put into action and see what an actual project plan might look like. I'm also going to provide a downloadable PDF of my project plan, so if you're so inclined, you can really spend some time with it. And finally, I'm including a blank downloadable template that you can use for your project plan. It contains all of the elements we talked about earlier in this lesson. It also includes some blank spaces so you can craft your own project plan. Now, of course, you're not required to use my template for your project plan. It's just a resource that's there for you if you want it. Well, thank you so much for joining me in this lesson. I will see you back here for Lesson 8, where you're going to learn how to design a studio system that will ensure that you get into the studio consistently, that will make sure you have the right habits and time management skills necessary for you to complete your creative projects. This can be one of the hardest skills for creative people. I look forward to seeing you there.